Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are wrapping up a trilogy. We have just finished reading the Powder Mage Trilogy by Brian McClellan, and the book we are here to discuss today in its totality is The Autumn Republic.
Yes, and now we have the chance to discuss spoilers throughout all of the trilogy. I'll say if you've made it this far to our Autumn Republic episode, then hopefully you've had the chance to listen to our Promise of Blood episode and our Crimson Campaign episode. And I think we're excited to get into a no-holds-barred conversation that and all of it is fair game. I'm looking forward to this, Charles, because we've had not a ton of conversation about this book and how the trilogy finishes to this point.
Right. No, we have not. This was my first read through, your second. So there's a lot of series ending stuff we need to talk about. Character arcs completed, all these reveals throughout this book that we want to talk through. But before we can do any of that, we need to get through one of your famous spoiler warnings. I mean, do we need to say too much more before we get into that?
I mean, yeah, we've tried to do a little bit more spoiler-free stuff, usually in these episodes before getting into the deep depths of spoiler territory. But, I don't know, a third book where so much of it makes sense to talk about at a spoiler level, I'll say maybe all there is to get at is I thought it's a very satisfying conclusion to this series. If you've read the other two and you haven't yet read the third, then I feel like Brian McClellan delivers. I mean, we know he is from the school of Sanderson, and something that Sanderson is famous for is his strong endings. They'll call it the Sanderlanche. And I think that McClellan seems to have taken those lessons to heart in terms of wrapping up each character's arc in a way that feels satisfying, although it does also, I think a lot of it, lead into future books in the series or in the world, because I haven't read those other books yet. I've only read this trilogy, but you can totally see how there's a lot left on the table despite the satisfying conclusion. And that's a hard line to walk. And I'd be interested to see where he goes with all of this in future books in this world. I know there's a bunch of them, but
a lot of
I
short
feel pretty
stories
good.
and novellas and things.
Yeah, I feel pretty good with where it ends, and I'm wondering if you feel the same, Charles.
No, I would agree. Well said. The only thing I'll add is just a really strong representation of military fantasy and even, what a lot of people are calling flintlock fantasy, which is a relatively new genre for me. I haven't read a whole lot of specifically, fantasy with guns set in a more industrial era time period. And I haven't read a whole lot of military, dedicated military fantasy either. And I think Brian McClellan delivers a really solid series in both of those fronts, just a really great representation of the genre. And I think that's why these books always pop up in top fantasy series. I think he formulated the series just right. It's like coming up from the school of Sanderson and having all of that influence and reading people like Joe Abercrombie and all those really popular early 2000s, genre leading authors, and then carving your own space in all of that, taking all of that influence and building your military flintlock fantasy series. Really great formula, really fun formula that he had delivered with an exciting conclusion at the end, which, like you said, Dylan, can be so hard to live up to sometimes. So yeah, great stuff. highly recommend
Right.
for all of you checking this out that haven't read the books yet. Just feel free to check them out. You will not be disappointed. They're very fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a way in which McClellan's writing, I mean this is the most positive way possible, comes off almost like edgy Sanderson, which is still not quite edgy in a broader perspective compared to stuff that we think of as more typical grimdark. You'd think of things like Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns, and you mentioned Abercrombie, like pretty much all of his books, and there's plenty more in that all-out grimdark side of things. This finds a middle ground between the more, I think this is the right word, chaste Sanderson style of writing, and then you can see so much of the influence, especially in things like magic systems, but bring it more toward middle ground
and plotting, and
you mentioned
character arcs and things too, like and reveals and things. Lots of influence.
Those
there
feel
from
very
Sanderson.
Sandersonian, and then I'll say on the military fantasy front, there's it's interesting because you said, oh, I haven't read a lot of military fantasy, and I was like, I feel like we have to have read a lot on the show, but we've more read stuff for the most part that is, of course, has military stuff going on in battles, but that don't necessarily fall as deeply into the military fantasy subgenre as this. Right. And I would say also the previous book in this series, the Crimson Campaign, where almost all of the book is dedicated to military actions and strategy, and then, of course, battles. And I'll say that the only ones I can really think of off the top of my head that are as much like this straight up military fantasy, I would say The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie is military fantasy. And also, I would say The Dragon Republic, which is the second book in the Poppy War trilogy, is actually essentially all military fantasy.
That's true. Yeah.
Other than those two, I'm wondering what else would come to mind, but it might be a rarer thing than it seems.
There's battles going on in other Joe Abercrombie works, but it's not like you said. The distinction is there. Like John Gwynne stuff, I think that's more focused on battles and fight scenes than military strategy. I've read things like The Black Company, which is definitely military fantasy that we have not covered on the show. Game of Thrones, I'd say, has a lot of military stuff in it.
Right, but I still wouldn't say that's military fantasy.
No.
But would you, when recommending Game of Thrones, of course you'll discuss the battles and the war and all that kind of stuff. And maybe you could say, weirdly, also a book too, like Clash of Kings, feels as close as you're going to get to just saying this is military fantasy. But even so, it's so, there's so much more going on.
Right. This is definitely dedicated to the nuances of military strategy, which is very fun. I was enjoying all the different scenes, like in Crimson Campaign, where they're being chased in the woods and they're trying to make traps, and then in this book where they have new powers at their disposal and how they use that and how they go up against stronger foes and things like that. So the whole espionage of, like, I won't get into it, but there's crisscrosses, double crosses, triple crosses, quadruple crosses. It's like it's happening all over the place here. So it's exciting stuff for sure, and lots to talk about. But he does. It's an interesting lens in which to look through Flintlock fantasy, is emphasis on the military strategy, and it's like I said, I think it's the reason why it kind of sticks up as a solid recommendation just across the board for fantasy fans, because of this comfortable niche that it fully delivers on.
Right. That's well said, Charles. And I think that's all that there really is for us to say in the spoiler-free section. I'm going to give my patented spoiler warning here, and we'll get into the deep depths.
Let's do it.
So you probably realize that if you haven't yet read the Autumn Republic or the previous two books in the Powder Mage Trilogy, then we're going to get into that right about now. So this is a good time to turn this down in your headphones if you fall into that category. We haven't yet read anything else in the Powder Mage world besides those three books, so we wouldn't even know how to spoil future books if we wanted to. So you don't have to worry about any of that stick around if you fall into that category.
Well said, Dylan. And like, I don't know where you want to start, but for me, I think the first thing we have to talk about now that we're in the spoiler-filled zone, you've been warned, is Field Marshal Tanis and his whole story, because this is really, at the end of the day, kind of his series, right? Like, he's the main character, and in this book, he's returning to Adro and fighting to save the capital that's been basically taken over by the enemy. And there's a lot of political stuff going on that there's some good battle espionage stuff too, and we should probably get into that, but I'm just like still kind of reacting to the obvious biggest most grandest spoiler and kind of ending moment for this whole book is the death of Field Marshal Tanis as well, which I thought, what a great way to end the series. Like, here's a character that pretty much exists in this conflict and is the embodiment of the conflict, and the only way to really move on is to leave him like in the era. Great way to like send him off. Great way to send off the trilogy. Like, putting the two together to me was poetic justice, poetic beauty, if you will.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree that it's Field Marshal Tanis's series beyond anyone else's, and that's so well stated that he's kind of yesterday's man by the time that all of this ends and we're moving forward into the time of the Republic. And in that sense, it makes it's very reasonable for him to die and for it to feel like that almost has to happen for the country to move forward. It's a kind of thing where there's even moments where they don't want Claremont to become the first minister of the Republic, and then people are talking about Tanis, and they're like, well, if it looks like he's going to win, like, Field Marshal Tanis isn't going to allow that to happen. He's just going to march in here and he's going to take out Claremont. Like, that, if you don't think that's going to happen, you don't know Field Marshal Tanis. And then I forget who it is, but it's kind of someone replies like, yeah, I actually don't think he would do that, even though that's in his nature, because if he does that, he's destroyed the idea of the Republic where you actually do get to vote in someone. And it's like he's weirdly created a world that he no longer fits in, given his nature is one of, I don't want this, I'm charging in with the military and I'm destroying everything I don't like. So it's almost like he would not make sense in the world he's built.
And that's an interesting way to phrase it, because he is the one that instigated all of this change. And from the very beginning, he killed all the cabal and beheaded all the royalty. Like, he was the agent of change, right? And it was his vision to create this republic, and he's been fighting these battles since the beginning. And you think of, for all you American history buffs out there, George Washington,
the cherry tree.
Yes, that's right. And he's,
I saw Hamilton.
So
Not that the cherry tree was in
all you American history or Hamilton buffs out there may be familiar with George Washington, who was a military hero, led the revolution and ended up becoming president. But it's one of those interesting things of like, and it kind of mirrors what maybe this theme of how to successfully transition power or progress in an era. It's like it takes the foresight and the sacrifice of people to see the vision and not necessarily make themselves part of it, which I think is part of Brian McClellan's genius in this ending, and also his antagonists who are immortal and want to maintain power forever and like oppress people. So you have those two things going up against each other, and you have Tanis, who's always been kind of right, always been the golden boy, always been, doing the right thing, to realize, hey, my time is over. And even though the gods want to keep me around and they love working with me and all the kings love working with me and all the people love me and stuff, it's like, I was just here to shake things up and be that agent of change. And now I'm ready to hand it off. And that is a really interesting statement on the transition of power and how a society can progress that I think accompanies military fantasy really well. So I was overall very pleased with Brian McClellan's and impressed with Brian McClellan's ending.
That's really well said, Charles. And I love the George Washington comparison. I think that's super apt because Hamilton fans and history buffs will both remember that George Washington, this is true to history, sang a song called One Last Time.
Oh, right. I think I remember reading about that in our history class together. Yeah.
That was, yes. Yeah, that was his final address to the nation. And it was basically about this idea that like he could keep running for president over and over again and keep winning the presidency over and over again. And of course, Hamilton wanted him to do so because Hamilton was the right-hand man. But Washington knew, like, a person like me, I'm almost like too big of a like hero in people's minds and too big of a personality where I need to actually set the precedent that I'm not going to run again. And then people will know, hey, this is a republic. This isn't just like, I'm not just King George the whatever I would be, because his name is George too, you know?
It would be the first, I'd assume.
Well, yeah. No, but there's the actual, wasn't King George the actual king in England at the time? So it's like, I'm making like a joke, but I don't know the numbers. So he's like, I'm not just King George the Fourth.
Right.
Like, I have to show them a president is different than that. And though Tamas doesn't as like deliberately display that, and he wasn't ever elected, the first minister, which feels very president-y, he does kind of like move on, be it through
there is in like the accepting scene, death. This acceptance,
right. And he's, I think he kind of knows as long as he were around in this new republic, even if there is a first minister, people would still view somehow field marshal as being above first minister as long as Tamas is alive. So you said it feels poetic that it ends this way for Tamas, and I totally agree. I think Tamas had to die, otherwise it wouldn't be as satisfying a conclusion, even if we love him and it's like tragic seeing him die in his son's arms. Yeah, there's an acceptance from Tamas, and I think for a lot of readers, myself included, there's a sense that of acceptance, because I'm like, he does kind of have to go at this point.
Well said. I mean, is there anything better for the FTF podcast when like character development and thematic development come together, and then also have this greater kind of stance on the transition of power and change and all of these other things. It's surprisingly rare, I would say, in fantasy, even though we love to talk about how every book has a theme and this and that, but it's like to interlace all of these things together so well and so completely and focus it on this one moment that is Taniel's death. Or Tanis's death, not Taniel's. To focus it all on that point is really strong. Not an easy thing to do as an author, and I respect it greatly. So, it is the most exciting part of the book for sure.
Yeah, and I think that the ending is most exciting from pretty much all the characters' arcs. I think all of them come to a reasonable place. You did mention Taniel, even if it was mistakenly. And interesting along the same lines, Taniel chooses to fake his own death and leave, run off with Kapol into the sunset. And he chooses to do that primarily because he doesn't want to be viewed as just Tamas too. And we've known for a long time that Taniel is not Tamas. Like, you see how it feels actually very authentic to like a son and his father, right? Like, there's going to be things you see where you're like, oh, that's so the Tamas side of him. He definitely got that from his dad. But there's also ways in which he doesn't take to leadership in the same way that that Tamas did. He always kind of fit more into the guy who wants to go rogue and do his own thing and fight against the leadership, but I don't think he'd know what to do if he was in charge. And and
he's shown that he hasn't kind of fit well in the wheel of politics by pretty much getting himself court-martialed the minute his dad wasn't around to protect him.
Right.
You know?
But I don't think he'd fit well at the top of the chain either, because I don't think he really cares about commanding other people to do stuff. He's just never really shown a desire to do that. He just goes and plays hero ball, as they would say.
Or fight the battle in the political realm and not on the front lines, like killing stuff, you know?
No,
he's more of a literal guy in that stance, too.
Yeah. So it makes sense he does one final act of going rogue by pretending to die and leaving, because he doesn't really... he makes sense from the war hero angle of, like, this is a popular candidate, but he basically makes one appearance at a like an event to try to promote Rickard's campaign, and then by the end he's just like, I hate this. I hate everything that just happened. Can I leave? And that's what he does, is he leaves.
Right, exactly. It kind of reminds me of, like, again, for all you history buffs, but maybe not Hamilton buffs, this is a little later, but Ulysses Grant, who was like a war hero that Hamilton. Became up. No, not in Hamilton.
Unfortunately.
So does he even exist? But you may recognize him from the $50 bill. He's on the 50.
$150 bill.
He's on the 50. And but you know, not exactly a loved politician, but a famous war hero who was known for being all chummy with the troops and, you know, wearing the same uniform and like being on their level, and had this huge war hero status, and not so much in the political realm. And he was also like substance abuse and stuff as part of his career as well. So really interesting parallels to be had on that as well. But in this case, Taniel has the foresight to be like, politics, not for me. I'm out of here. And the other thing he decides to do is spare the life of Julene, which is also kind of the culmination of his thematic character arc as well, of where he's always chosen violence, and the solution is to run into the front lines and kill stuff, was to spare this person that had asked to kill him, you know, at one point, and made him promise to kill her. And she's like, oh, JK, I changed my mind. And he's like, okay, cool. And that's, you know, the ending there of choosing peace over violence, you know, essentially.
Right. He does turn to the camera and he says, no, I think there's been enough bloodshed for one trilogy. And that's how
roll
he moves
credits.
We gave you the promise of blood in book 1, but how about the promise of peace? That's what he said.
And then he put his sunglasses
Just like
on
George,
right before he delivered that line, and then the Who's like, yeah!
That is what he said, just as much as the truth is that George Washington sang his final address as he said goodbye to the nation and retired to the fields of Virginia.
Correct, yeah. The only killing was done in George Washington's performance, right? That's the
yeah.
Really slayed there. But in terms of actually ending lives, this one time Daniel decided not to, but what was important was it was the last time, so that made it important, and he's good from there. And you have Laura at the end describing them as ghosts of the past, of this idea of like this whole bloody campaign, if you will, to get to the Republic, right? What was the acts of a dying generation, of a dying way in which we conduct ourselves politically and, you know, as a society, and now this is a new age, essentially.
Right. And that's what's interesting about the idea of future stories in this world, because you wonder how Daniel is still alive. It's hard to imagine that his arc is completely over with and then I left. And it's like, how does he fit into this new world? How does Kapol fit into it? We don't really know, but we do have this idea of how Flora fits into it. And she's the general at the end, I believe, or she's basically the number one military person in the country by the end of it. And I think, it's tough because we've talked some already about Vlora feeling like something of a lost opportunity as a character. Like, I feel like her place in the story has always been one that feels very interesting, but something's just missing in terms of fleshing out the depth of her as a character, at least in this trilogy. Like, she's always kind of there, and she's a part of the things that Tamis is doing, and it makes sense that she'd be going on to be the person in charge of the military by the end, because she's basically been studying under Tamis this entire time. But she just very rarely does she make herself known in a way important to the plot. She doesn't really have an arc in the way that we're talking about, like, oh, Tamis's arc is so poetic the way it ends. Like, Daniel's totally fits with his character and how things have gone. And then it's like, Vlora, well, I guess it makes sense because, like, all the other military leaders are dead, or Daniel ran away and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, I guess I see why she would be in that role. But it's like, I just wish Vlora got fleshed out more, because I think this could have also been a super poetic end to a character arc, but I don't know.
Right, especially because of where she ends up as the leader of this new world. It's like, well, who even is she really? We know that she's had a complicated history with both Tanis and Daniel, kind of pushing those relationships from like a social perspective. And she was the only one that was able to kind of push back against Tanis and like stand up to him and be kind of a bit of out of order as a soldier. But telling him what he needs to hear some ways. And we got that somewhat, like you said. So it would have been interesting to have gotten more time with her. But, I think this book is so much about ending Tanis's arc that just there's someone that fills that role, and maybe we'll get to know more in future installments. Yeah. It opens up the potential to get to know that person. But I think Tanis and Daniel had to be out of the picture so that we can focus on it, maybe, is part of where we're going. But I agree, I wouldn't have minded more of a focus on her. Another character I wouldn't have minded more of a focus on, who actually is a POV character, is Nyla, who has a very interesting moment relatively earlier in the book. I think even more exciting than like the end of her arc is when she first takes her skills to battle and just burns thousands of people alive at once, and it's described as like, oh, she's been training, she hasn't quite figured it out yet, and then all of a sudden she gets pressured, and then she's like, "Wah!" and she just wipes out an entire army and shifts the whole tide of the battle, and you're like, "Oh, okay." And she's just kind of like coming to terms with what she's done, and I don't think she had. It's this interesting moment where she realizes later, and she's trying to like sum up what she's done and make sense of what she's done, and it's a long time with her arc dedicated to her dealing with that, which I was really enjoying, and it's probably the most entertaining part of her entire arc throughout the whole trilogy. I don't know what you thought, Dylan.
Yeah, for me, Nyla burning thousands of people to a crisp was very cathartic, which sounds odd to say that so many deaths, but they're nameless characters, so it's like, whatever. It felt cathartic to me because it's been, at that point, like 2.5 books of Nyla as this character that's like full of promise and full of potential and all these things that she could become and could be, especially once we find out that she's a privileged. And then it's just like we haven't seen it. We haven't really seen it. And Bo is promising how amazing she's going to be, and she's going to be the most powerful, privileged that we've seen in centuries because she doesn't have to wear gloves. And then she just unleashes all of that onto these poor nameless characters. And it's just like, yes, like finally this is coming to fruition. I've waited like over 1,000 pages for this to happen, well over 1,000 pages. And it's exciting. And I like the idea of Nyla as a character that is in some ways like physically at this point more talented and equipped to handle these situations than anyone, but mentally she just isn't quite where she needs to be yet, not from an intelligence standpoint, but from a preparedness standpoint, because all these other privileged are being like trained from their youth. And Nyla's like, I'm just a laundress from the Two Rivers. And right. Except the difference between her and our favorite shepherd from the Two Rivers is that we completely buy that Nyla would be struggling with that, because we've seen 2.5 books, or at least like 2 books or so, of her mostly being a laundress. So it's like, I completely see where you're coming from when you are struggling with all of this, and it's like traumatic for you when maybe that's not the case for some other characters, where they try to make it seem like they came from really humble beginnings and they would really be struggling with everything they're struggling with. It's like, we've seen it from Nyla. Right. We've seen her do the laundry.
Yes. Oh, yes. And we've seen her kind of get like steamrolled, kidnapped, forgotten about, rendered powerless, all this other stuff. Like we've seen all of it. So it's kind of interesting to see someone being thrust into the center of power that's not used to it and is having all of these very human and natural reactions to killing a lot of people en masse, where Adam, it's like, hey, can you do that again? Like Tanis, excuse me, is like, hey, can you do that again? That'd be super useful. And like, I can move you like a piece on a chessboard right to the front. And she's like, that was horrifying. I hated that. So it's kind of funny to see how those two kind of come at each other. And he's even like, the laundress wants to come to a political meeting. Like, what's going on here? So all of that was very fun. One of the things I wish and I guess maybe this is, that sequel potential that we've been kind of touching on, is like the true nature of her abilities, like why she doesn't need gloves. Right. Because we know, like, we did get the reveal at the end that all of these gods are really just really powerful mages, right? They're not.
Can I say something on that, Charles?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's treated like it's this big reveal at the end, but that's been that's been clear from like the first book. Didn't Adam, like in the form of Mihaly, say that like in the first book?
He was like, he basically said
that's
like,
confusing to me.
Like it's hard to explain what we are, and to say God is just much easier for you guys to understand. So let's go with God. Was pretty much.
But I swear, if you listen to our past episodes, like we're talking about how
I wasn't like, what?
That they're just super.
It wasn't.
It does feel like it's supposed to be a reveal, but it's. I think it's like literally said by either Mihaly or.
I think like there's more insight into the idea that, hey, these are just also random people that were from a certain age that just happen to be wielding crazy power, and. The whole point of this book is that, hey, leaders need to succeed power and let the new generation kind of do their thing. And these are literally immortal human beings with too much power that are causing destruction. Like how many really old people in politics do we find frustrating today? It's one of those things. It's like, get out already, get out. Like, let the Vloras of the world come in and let's see what they can do. Like, I don't need an 80-year-old person, coming in here trying to do all this crazy crap, or 100-million-year-old person. So there is that implication, and you see, and you see Nyla having showing those same signs, but it's never said that the two are connected, but you can't help but wonder, like, is Nyla someone with the potential to be a god, or whatever we're calling a god? Like, what is the story behind all this? And all we get is the confirmation that they were people once that just have a lot of power, and we don't really understand how or why, or, like, even with Nyla specifically, what's going on with her, why she's special in terms of her magical abilities and all these other things. Like, is it something in the water? Is it a freak chance? Was she chosen? Like, I don't know. It's the water, yeah.
She's having some of that sweet, sweet Poland spring water from Maine.
Something in that laundress water that just
some detergent
awakened her innate abilities.
Yeah, some detergent got in her eye, and it gave her magic powers in the same way.
She just has microfibers of clothes that mimic gloves that make her be able to use magic.
That must be it. She's handled so much fabric already in her life, Charles, that she doesn't need any more over her hands. Maybe they're just like, it's all stuck to her hands anyway, and she just doesn't realize she's not wearing fabric as protection.
Right.
I think we're onto something.
That would be quite the twist. It would be a very sci-fi reason. All the macro particle, boson particles of the clothes from all the laundry. None of the other privileged have ever done laundry before, so they have to wear gloves.
And also,
and then you see all of a sudden all these privileges start doing laundry all the time and to try and break free of the gloves, and like everyone's clothes are super clean now.
Right, Charles. It's also
the price of soap becomes super high.
Yeah, it's also a statement on how privilege in our modern society can result in lack of basic life skills, like ability to do laundry, and how that can actually come to and how that can come to
get Brian
cause
McClellan
them.
on the phone. He needs to know this.
Yeah. And Charles, how those lack of basic life skills can actually cause them to be weaker in the end than the people who do learn them.
I love that. Bring a little classism into the thematic discussion here. I love that. Yes.
Yeah.
McClellan, you can have that for free.
I'm sure that's what he wants.
I'm sure, the fans would love to read that that's the source of Nyla's powers. She's just so good at doing laundry that she was able to develop superpowers. Right.
Yeah. Well, that's Nyla for you. I will say that it's interesting to think about that line that we talked about that McClellan walks, where he leaves a lot of that kind of stuff open-ended.
Yeah.
Where you might expect, hey, and I think Sanderson probably wouldn't do that. Like, I think Sanderson would probably, if he revealed, this character doesn't have to use gloves when all the other characters who do what they do has to wield gloves, like, he is telling you the answer to that by the end of the trilogy. And I think that's a difference that McClellan chose here, where McClellan's like, nope, you're going to have to read like a future series in this world if you want that. Or maybe, I don't know if it's ever revealed. But Sanderson takes those kind of, I think, those kind of things as promises that he will deliver an answer that's satisfying by the end of, that series.
Well said. Yeah, it is satisfying, and you can tell that he has a lot of sequel potential and a lot of stuff planned. I know that he's written a lot of short stories and stuff and more books in this world, and you can tell even from these, like, this first trilogy, how much he's planning to grow and expand this world. So I'd be very curious to see where he kind of picks it up and how he gets the whole Powder Mage universe, built out and extended. But
the Powderverse.
The Powderverse, yeah. It does kind of sacrifice the trilogy, but it gives it more sequel potential, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. I think Nyla kind of suffered from that trade-off a little bit. It would have been nice to know, like, what is up with her in the first place, like. But we'll continue to wonder and check out more books from Brian McClellan for sure to find out.
Definitely. Well, Charles, that leaves Adamat as a character to talk about, and also I think once we get through that, there's probably a couple loose ends in terms of twists to talk about, probably mostly around the idea of the the gods at the end, the dueling gods, and how how our big bad evil guy Claremont was actually a god the whole time. All that kind of stuff we'll get into, but let's not do Adamat dirty first and talk about his arc. I think Adamat's an interesting character because he's of all the point of view characters, once Nyla really gets going, Adamat is the only one without super badass powers. Like we've got basically just powder mages and the most powerful privileged in centuries coming into her own. And it's like Adamat has a good memory. And it's interesting to see him try to find his place in a world that is just like chaos, constant fighting, and he even gets himself in a couple situations where it looks like, okay, maybe like maybe he's dead, because we've got like at one point a black warden, which is like half powder mage, half warden, and he ends up getting attacked by this monstrosity. And he notices that the warden is missing I believe, ring finger. And that is a clue to him that, this is my son, Joseph. Because I know he showed powder mage potential. I know he was taken by the Kez. And I know he's missing the old ring finger. So he is an inspector. He can put it all together that this is probably his son, who he's been searching for, who he's like used his favor with Bo to try to help him locate. This has been like a book plus of this being probably his main goal. He's doing a lot of inspecting, but if he could have one thing, it would be find his son. And he has, but not in the way he wanted to. So he like yells Joseph's name at it, and then it like runs off like a Frankenstein's monster, like with his like hands over his head, like confused or whatever. That's how I'm picturing it. And
the other thing that they set up nicely was he has perfect memory, right? So there's moments where Adamat's like he wish he could have any kind of doubt, but his perfect memory, he just recognized the face of the warden and the face of his son, and they're the same. And we through that connection, we're able to know that this is real. It's not one of those moments where you're led to believe that this is not really Bo or no, I mean, this is not really Joseph. Could be anybody, but he's like, nope, I have perfect memory, and yes, it's really him. So I thought that was a nice touch to kind of remove any doubt while also kind of referencing something we've already known about Adamat this whole time. And it was a good reveal. It was like you feel bad because there's just no good solution at that point. Like you couldn't imagine anything more horrible to happen.
You can't, and Adamat sees it that way too. He sees it as a fate worse than death, and it's interesting to watch him grapple with that. And he eventually decides on telling Bo, hey, I want to renegotiate our deal. Instead of finding him, I want you to kill him and kill my son. And that's an interesting play. You learn some stuff about Adamat. He's a man who's pragmatic, and he's willing to have that happen. You get this interesting psychological stuff with him that I appreciate. And other than that, he's always kind of played this role in the story of the story has a lot of mysteries, a lot of things that are big questions that we need answers to. And Adamat has always kind of played the role of the like slowly revealing the things that we need to know to like give us answers, but also raise more questions that are going to move the plot forward. And he kind of keeps playing that role here, and I guess that actually leads pretty well into his how he ends up finding out about Claremont and Claremont and is it Cheris, I believe, their true identities as the god Brood and Brood's two shadows or whatever. I don't know. His two. He was they were conjoined twins, and then Kresimir separated them, and they're not happy about it.
No, they're very upset about it, actually. And Cheris, Cheris.
Yeah,
I would say it that way. Yeah, and it's all part of, like, for Adamat, you're like his ending, right? It's like at what point is he gonna like be done? Retire, go home with his family? Is he even capable of that? Can he ever be the one to kind of put down the trail and just be happy with his family? And I think having Bo being like unable to save at all, it is kind of a nice way to be like, okay, this guy's technically done. Like, he's saved his family of what he could save, and like he's let go of the pieces that he can't. Like, this is time for him to, retire. What a great moment. And yet there's still these things that compel him, like, or that are needed of him from his country to continue to do. I can't really remember what like the last scene of Taniel's Adamat's was. I'm trying to remember. Like, I know confronted.
I don't know if
but did he really get like his moment like Tanis and Taniel did, or he just kind of was like he was in a scene, and that was also his last scene. I feel like was kind of what happened to him.
You know how they say, like, you don't. It's like being a parent. There will come a time where you will lift your child for the last time because they're going to get too big, and eventually you stop picking up your kid, physically picking them into the air. But you don't know when the last time is that you're going to do it. So it's like at some point you put them down for the final time. That's reading the final Adamat chapter. It's like you don't know it's the final Adamat chapter when you're reading it. But there was a time where you stopped reading Adamat chapters.
That's kind of what I remember. You hope he retires nicely with his family.
I do know what happened. What happened is, and it is not like some big moment, but it does fit with this, where he is talking to Rickard, and Rickard is like, I'm going to need you and your wife to play some like bureaucratic role in my new republic. And well, actually, he's like saying, Rickard's like, I'm going to hire you again. And Adamat is like, dude, I cannot take on another job as an inspector. Like, my wife will kill me. And then Rickard is like, oh no, well, that would be a problem because your wife is already hired, and it's not an inspector job. It's like a bureaucratic role that probably will be way less dangerous, and it's basically retirement. It's like when Lionel Messi went to play for the team in Miami, soccer, and he's like, well, this is still technically a job, but this is basically just a vacation. And I imagine that Adamat is in some cushy role where Rickard is just kind of, he's probably doing some work, but Rickard is mostly just rewarding him and his wife for everything that he's put them through and everything they've been through. So I see it that way. It's what the word, Charles? You know the word? I think it's sinecure. Sinecure, I believe, is the word.
Sinecure? I don't know that word.
Sinecure. Yeah. You want to check that one up? Yeah.
I don't even know how to spell it. I'll ask you to check it while I just react, because I agree. He did take the messy route because it's like, what is retirement like for such a workhorse? It's just a less burdensome job. That's the retirement. And the fact that his wife already accepted is that touching moment of like, this is how they're able to move on. And so that is a nice touch. I do remember that happening. I can't hear.
Oh, hold on.
He's trying to get the pronunciation on his phone to work. Listen.
Okay, give me 1 sec. This is good content.
Listen carefully.
Do you hear that?
Yeah, play it again. One more.
Oh, yeah.
Sinecure.
And what's the
Sinecure.
definition?
A position requiring little or no work, but giving the holder status or financial benefit. That's how I imagine the role, because I want it to basically be retirement for Adamat, because
That's true. It's kind of like when they
even
gave
if it
the
is-
old voice of Mario, the role is like Mario Ambassador. That's your job now.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, okay. There's basically a sinecure.
Yeah.
I know a word now. This is exciting. How do I get one of these? Golly.
A sinecure, yeah. Once FTF really makes it, and then we replace other people, like other people come in and they're the talent, they're the ones actually doing the talking and reading the books, all kind of stuff, and we are fantasy talking ambassadors.
Yeah.
No, we're fantasy
we'll be
talking
ambassadors.
ambassadors.
Located out of Miami.
Right, exactly. South Beach.
Yeah. That's where the ambassador headquarters is.
Right.
Someplace warm.
Definitely.
Okay, I remember that now. Cool. Well, that was Adamant for you. Great arc there. Loved all those investigative chops. The thing with Bo, I think, was the most exciting, for sure, highlight of his arc, even though it was very tragic. But you're happy that him and his wife are able to work together and move on in the face of all the tragedy that they've had to experience. And I know his wife was dealing with a whole lot of depression and things like that throughout the story as well, and they were trying to figure out like what's next for us, and Adamat kept getting offered jobs that she didn't like, and they were trying to find a dynamic. And it's kind of interesting. There was like a moment also where he couldn't he always couldn't tell couldn't tell his twins apart, and didn't. It was like this moment where they highlighted that he was kind of disconnected from the family that he's working so hard to maintain. And it's like, you don't even know which kid is which.
And you got perfect memory, bro. There's no excuses.
Perfect memory.
You have to look at them once. I mean, it's like he hasn't looked at them once.
Yeah,
but,
right.
Yeah, I'll also say, when it comes to these ideas of leaving threads open for future series in the world, Adamat and his wife basically adopt the heir to the throne. And then the question is, was that Jakob, right? Jakob or something like that? Yeah. So he would be the closest living relative to the Manhooch.
Yep.
Is that right? That's a weird
Manhooch,
name.
yeah, that's who he is.
It's weird when I say it aloud.
It's
I'm
that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, can we say Manhooch on this clean podcast? You're gonna have to beep that out, Charles. But Manhooch looked easier to read it. Manhooch was the king, and this is his closest living relative. And there's all this stuff early on in the first book where the royalists found him and they want him to be the new king, and Tamas took him, and then what was the guy's name that was Bo tore all his limbs off? You remember?
Oh yeah, that guy.
Yeah, the bad guy.
Yeah, he was no good.
He was bad.
He had his wife too. Yeah.
Well, something with a V, but I can't remember. But we all remember that character in essence. Mm-hmm. He also captured Jakob because he wanted to do stuff with it. So we had all these people who wanted to do stuff with Jakob. And then what becomes of it just, gets adopted by Adamat and his wife. So is that a loose thread that could be a problem in the future? Or is that just in the end, Brian McClellan didn't exactly know
Lord Vitas, by the way.
Lord Vitas, thank you. Didn't exactly. Is it that McClellan just was I still have this character it felt was important, but in the end, it's just I don't know what to do with him. Who knows? We'd have to read future
it's part of that sequel potential, right? It's here's the rightful heir to the throne that no longer exists. It's are some people going to come after him, or does he get to live a peaceful life in obscurity? It's It's hard to tell, but it's just another one of those spinning plates that has potential for a story in the future, right?
Yeah.
And you can definitely tell that Brian McClellan has a bigger picture in mind for where this world is going to go, and who knows? No guarantee that this character will play a part in that, but it's interesting to see.
For sure. I would say the last thing to discuss, really, unless you've got anything else on your mind, Charles, really is this just the reveals and the more plotty parts of the end. I know we talked about the character arc side of it, but just thoughts on these reveals around the god brood, and it was at Claremont was this god the whole time, but there's also another half, just all of that kind of stuff. And then we can also just talk about, I guess, like the scene itself of how like Daniel, Tamis, and Kapol all kind of combine to kill Brood in the end.
Yeah, the Brian McClellan does definitely have chops when it comes to writing action scenes, and I thought this one was particularly exciting. Brood as a character is rather fascinating, and the way this god kind of entered the election and has another half that's conspiring and all of these other things was a good face-off. And then to bring Kresimir back into the mix as well was kind of interesting, and you get to figure out what's really going on. It's a bunch of it's a quabbling family of siblings that hate each other that have too much power and time.
This whole issue.
It's just like kids in the back of the car fighting, is basically the vibe that this little sibling dispute has. There's also the reveal that the chef god is still alive.
Mihaly comes back as Mihaly the White.
Yeah, which from the last episode, I was like, this guy is definitely not dead, dude. I don't believe it for a second. Mihaly, the Michelin star chef, has arrived, and it's funny to watch him take over a body, and that body just slowly gains weight. You're like, I see. This was a nice little, some of the best personality development for a character. This character's fun, and he's just charming. He takes over the scenes that he's in. Really fun character. You can tell that Brian McClellan really had an affinity to this character. So no surprise that he has returned. Like you said, Dylan, very much a Gandalf experience here. That it was just good to
Lord
have
of the Rings spoilers for all you people in the tail end of a book 3 of the Powder Mage Trilogy who have not yet gotten around to experiencing Lord of the Rings either through the movies or the books. There's just been a slight spoiler implied for you, but you are probably a very small number.
The statute of
listeners.
Limitations has been lifted on that.
Well,
one,
it's also
sure.
That's what I'm saying. It's we're deep cut. Third book of the Powder Mage Trilogy. Who's there but hasn't gotten around to Lord of the Rings? I don't.
But if they hadn't, then that reveal probably would be pretty exciting that a god has returned, that's got to be an exciting twist for someone that hasn't read or
I've never seen this before.
Yeah. Wow, what a exciting and novel concept I did not see coming at all.
Right.
But
they're out there. And sorry for making fun of you if you are out there.
And I think one of the things that makes Tanis feel like this bigger authority, this powerful presence, is that he is able to go toe to toe with all of these godlike characters. He is a powder mage, so he has some ability, but you always kind of feel like he's more down on the level of he's a human that's able to play on the theater of immortal gods, right? And so this scene kind of lives up to all of that, and Tanis's legend almost is kind of coming to a head here, where he's able to even compete, let alone fight and win in this arena where he would otherwise be like an ant to these people. So it was really, really great to see his character do that at be able to like go up against everyone at that level as well. It's I think one of my favorite things about Tanis is just the presence that he's able to command and also earn. It's one thing to be like, here's my main character, he's super awesome and better than everybody and everyone loves him, but it's another thing to command and earn that respect. And I feel like what makes Tanis such a great character is that he just does. And this is one of those moments where he's like really able to fight, and it's admirable, and it's, you see why he's had this legend status.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think especially in the Crimson campaign in the Republic, you see why Tanis is considered a god amongst men, and he's able to pretty much play the role of a god amongst gods in the ending here. He is of course like outmatched when it comes to fighting them, and he's, by the end of it, he's like on the ground, just basically all but dead. And he does get his moment of, if nothing else, distracting I think he stabs one half, like Cheris. I think he stabs Cheris in the leg or something like that. And Cheris is like, oh, how, like, you think that bothers me? I'm a god. And that's when Daniel is able to throw the gun over to Kapol, who finishes the job. And, props to Kapol for, she deserved to be the one that kills the, right. It's like she's been behind why Daniel's been able to like hurt gods and stuff in the past. So let her do it herself.
Oh yeah,
and
like she took on Kresimir last time. Like, come on, she's the only reason any of them are still alive.
Right. Yeah. Props to Kapol for finishing it off. When it comes to the reveals themselves, like I like Claremont as being at least half of Brood. And it's cool because Claremont has kind of been the big bad to this even more than someone like Kresimir or anything, because he's just been torturing everyone with his decisions behind the scenes, especially Adamat. And I like the reveal he's a god, because why not? All the like gods are hanging out doing stuff everywhere at this point, so why not make the biggest, baddest evil person in the story also be one? Cheris is kind of a random choice to be the other half. It's like I barely remembered who Cheris was. Cheris was like a banker who was like Rickard's lover. So I don't know why a god would choose. Interest. Yeah, I don't know why a god would choose like banging Rickard Tumbler as their main purpose in life, but
to try infiltrate the opposition, I guess, because it was a running mate, right? So just getting in and being able to know all his inner workings and secrets and stuff, and passing that along, a spy essentially.
I could see that. It just feels like there'd be something more worth doing with her time. But whatever. Who knows what she was doing when not with Rickard. And we've got this combination of gods here that are both... I don't know to what extent Brood is addressed in the earlier books, but... I'm still okay with the fact that there's another god and another sibling around. And I think it's satisfying at the end of the whole thing that, what's so interesting though?
Yeah.
Is so these characters were legitimately just trying to win an election the old fashioned way. And they only really went like all in on screw it, we're gods, we're killing all the people in our way when they lost the election, which is kind of funny. And it too, like the little speech that Claremont gives at the end is like, I thought the people could be trusted to elect someone who's actually here to unify stuff and to help and blah blah, but now I realize that they're not, so I'm gonna take it by force, which is kind of interesting. It's like they were very Machiavellian in the fact that like whoever we step on our way up the ladder like is fine, but if they are to be believed, they actually were like had good intentions in terms of why they were doing the stuff they were doing, and they wanted to do it in a relatively legitimate way. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. No,
They
it is.
weren't
And
just
it's
like
very
evil for
modern
evil's
fantasy,
sake.
right? Yeah, it's very modern fantasy, the trend you see where it's like, I've got good intentions and not like horrible ideas. And I
Yeah.
have the power to do it. But I'm, also like, kill them all.
Yeah.
Not
Well,
wait till the next election or anything like that. Just kill them all right now.
yeah, that is.
And the only
Yeah.
other thing I'll say is you had mentioned how Taniel and Tanis worked together in those final moments, and we had talked so much up until now of their complicated father-son relationship, and you kind of feel like they get to exchange last words and actually work together in the end, kind of out of a level of love and respect and acknowledgement of each other, was how they were able to take these gods down, and instead of walking in Tanis's footsteps, Taniel goes his own path, and there's a nice finality to their relationship in that aspect as well. It was one of my favorite dynamics throughout the trilogy, so to have it wrapped up where they're working together and say goodbye and move on it brings a nice element of finality to the trilogy that I enjoyed, even if it has a lot of sequel potential. It did have those nice moments.
Yeah, and I think those kind of moments are why this isn't outright grimdark in the way of something more Abercrombian or whatnot. Is in these moments, it's like McClellan chooses in a more Sandersonian way to be like, no, like my main character and his son, who's also a main character, who've had these kind of conflicts, they get like Tamis lives long enough where they do get their like last words conversation, and they do get the resolution that they're both looking for. And of course, we've talked about Tamis more accepting it, while in a more grimdark novel, you'd probably get like, that would be a like satisfying end to the arc that's been building for 3 books. But instead, the author chooses like, and then Tanya walked up to Tamis, and Tamis was dying, but maybe there's going to be some last words. And he just like gurgles like blood or something. And it's like, and that was it. And then he died. And it's like, see, like the real world doesn't always give you satisfying conclusions. Take that. I'm grimdark, which we love grimdark, but it's also nice to have moments where, like, oh, we do get that satisfying conclusion, and we feel good about it.
We do feel good about it. It's nice they had that moment, and in the end, this is a book about achieving love and peace, which is always a nice sentiment to have.
Ringo Starr-esque.
Peace and love. Yeah,
I'm ending this series with peace and love. Peace and love. I killed your main character with peace and love.
Yeah.
That was really bad. That was not my best Ringo.
Yes, after this, there will be no more killing with peace and love. Peace and love. I'm warning you with peace and love. No more killing. Exactly right. So, yeah, that wraps up the Powder Mage Trilogy, Dylan. Very exciting. This has been on my TBR for 9 years almost since it came. This last book came out in 2015. So, I just remember being like, oh, this guy went to school and was a student of Sanderson's and wrote this really popular book. I can't wait to read it. And I'm glad that we finally did get to bring it to the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. I had a great time. I'm looking forward to reading more of Brian McClellan's work in the future. Can't wait to see how this world expands and grows and what more McClellan has to say on military political machinations of the world. I'm very excited.
I think you've said it all there, Charles. I think there's nothing left to do except play that sweet, sweet outro music.
There is nothing left indeed, other than to say, hey, Friends Pitching Fantasy, I guess, is next, right? We have to figure out what we're going to read next now. We've read Gideon the Ninth. We've read The Powder Mage. So exciting times ahead. So don't miss next week's episode where we, pitch some potential books to read on the show. You're not going to want to miss it. But until then, like you said, let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping. Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, let us engage with us over on social media. That's a really great way to give us support, and that's over at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even further than engaging with us over on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. And to do that, for some reason, you have to click About at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast page. Then click that little star icon, and then you can rate us. Why is it under About? Who knows? Hopefully Spotify will change that. But right now, this is the way of doing it. On Apple Podcast, you can also rate and review, and that means you can write nice things about us, which always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Like you said, Dylan, just listening. Thank you all so much for making it all the way to the end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.